Hi, I'm Patrick Scott. Welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. We're going to finish our discussion today talking about defense and foreign policy, and specifically talk about the making of defense and foreign policy, the various actors and institutions that are responsible for the making of foreign and defense policy, and then we're going to conclude with a discussion of the various types of diplomatic tools that we have available to influence, to a greater or lesser degree, the behavior of other nations through these tools. Now, as you remember, as you recall from our last discussion, we really tried to put American foreign policy and defense policy kind of in context, in modern day context, as well as historical context. And we're talking about, for example, that on the one hand, we saw the history of these isolationist tendencies, and then other tendencies pulling us out of our isolationism, and as we became a world power. And at the same time, we also talked about, with our adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union beginning in the mid-1940s, and the Cold War from then on up through about 1991, and how that radically altered our conception of security and what we need to do to maintain our security to stop the communist influence and threat. And then I hope you came away with the understanding that even with the end of the Cold War, even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a lot of ways, what we've seen since that period of time is we find ourselves facing a world that's perhaps more precarious than ever before, with all of the different areas around the world, the various kinds of hot spots, and the continued potential access that many groups may have toward acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Keeps, again, a lot of policy analysts awake at night wondering, how do we ensure that we have the best policies in place to ensure our security? How do we have the best intelligence gathering operations in place to prevent these kinds of weapons of mass destruction from being delivered against the United States? So today we're going to talk about then sort of the making of foreign and defense policy and the various actors involved. And certainly, of course, we have to talk about the President and his constitutional responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He plays perhaps a leading role. He has more influence and more power than any other actor when it comes to the making of foreign and defense policy. And if you think about all the different resources and institutions and bureaucracy that serve the President, I mean, he has, for example, there's a National Security Council, part of the Executive Office of the President, headed by a National Security Advisor who keeps the President up to date on breaking issues that pertain to our security. He also has as the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, each of whom heads up these huge bureaucracies that are designed to help craft and make foreign and defense policy. We think, for example, about the Department of State. If you go look at an organization chart of the Department of State, you'll see that it's not only a huge bureaucracy in and of itself in Washington, but through all of our offices and embassies overseas, and the Foreign Service, and the ambassadors, all of whom are responsible for a lot of intelligence gathering and understanding what's going on in different countries. We have the Department of Defense, the Joint Chief of Staffs, the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, huge military of 1.9 million or so soldiers. So again, all of these are at the President's disposal. Besides that, we have intelligence gathering agencies that are very huge bureaucracies in and of themselves, the CIA and the NSA, the National Security Agency, whose sole purpose is to obtain intelligence, good intelligence, that that feed into the crafting of foreign and defense policies and our response to events going on around the world. So obviously the President plays the leading role in terms of the making of foreign and defense policy by virtue of his constitutional position and authority as Commander-in-Chief, and by the fact that he is the single person that we can go to in terms of leading our nation. But even though the President does have a leading role, Congress certainly does play a key role as well in terms of the making of foreign and defense policy. Back during our last discussion, for example, you know that Congress plays a leading role in the ratification of treaties. and the fact that, for example, Congress did not approve our entrance into the League of Nations as an example of that, and the fact that it requires a 2/3 votes to ratify treaties. And before, when we were talking about the presidency as an institution, we talked about how the president will rely upon more and more in executive agreements as opposed to treaties as a process to circumvent some of these institutional constraints to get around Congress and allow the president more of a free hand in crafting agreements with other countries. But nonetheless, Congress certainly has a very major role to play here. As we talked about before as well, the Senate, the U.S. Senate, can reject appointments to key posts at the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and ambassadors. And we talked about, for example, how years ago when George H.W. Bush was president, his first choice for the Secretary of Defense was John Tower, how the Senate Armed Services Committee rejected that appointment, and how that led to Dick Cheney becoming the Secretary of Defense. And that's how, of course, he eventually became Vice President through his myriad of experiences in the White House. But in any case, the Senate can reject appointments to these key posts, not only key cabinet positions, but also ambassadors around the world, and also as various attachés and assistants. The Senate plays a role in the approval of these appointments. We've also talked about the idea of budgetary power, where the Congress can play a major role in setting the budget for defense programs, for weapons programs, for how much money is going into support of various initiatives that are going on in the State Department and the Defense Department. So the Senate playing a major role in terms of the budgetary power can be a very significant influence as well in the making of foreign and defense policy. And of course, we have to go back to the Constitution. As you know, Congress has the constitutional power to declare war. And then we also know, again, looking at history, how Congress has actually taken steps to limit the president's power. So we think, for example, about the War Powers Resolution of 1973, designed to limit the president's ability to commit troops overseas without congressional approval. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 basically says that the president has to obtain congressional authorization to commit troops overseas if they were to stay there beyond 90 days. And of course, the Congress has the power to, through its oversight responsibilities, to investigate and to hold congressional hearings where they have top-level administration officials testify before Congress in terms of what's going on. So they may have the director of the CIA testify before Congress, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense testifying before Congress on what's going on, for example, in terms of abuses in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Just any kind of instances in terms of authorization of their budget. Top key administration officials will often testify before Congress during congressional committee hearings to explain and justify the administration's actions and positions on various issues and policies. And of course, top committees in Congress include the Senate Armed Services Committee, that helped craft the budget for the Department of Defense. There is also the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, the House Homeland Security Committee, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are among some of the key committees in both the House and the Senate that play a role in terms of the making of foreign and defense policies. And then also, again, other actors that are involved in the making of foreign and defense policy is, don't forget about the concept of the Iron Triangle, or even issue networks, or policy sub-governments that some texts talk about. But again, the Iron Triangle is a very, very good conceptual model, because what that is talking about is the influence of interest groups operating through the Iron Triangle. And again, that actually you can see that at work in terms of defense policy, where you've got three different actors of the Iron Triangle. You've got the interest groups. The relevant interest groups in this case would be the defense weapons contractors, or just military contractors in general. You've got congressional committees and subcommittees, and then you've got the relevant federal department or agencies, in this case the Defense Department, that is the Pentagon. And so you've got these three sets of actors working together to basically to each other's benefit. The defense contractors want more money for contracts. They lobby Congress and provide through PACs money to support congressional campaigns. That money then in Congress is through the budgetary process authorizes more money for the defense budget, and as the defense budget gets increases in size and scope, part of that is used, of course, for defense contractors. So again, you see sort of this very bit of a symbiotic relationship among all three sets of actors to help further their own prerogatives. And some people have criticized the power of these iron triangles because it tends to suggest that the policies that we have in place will mean that we have more money being spent in these areas than we should have. And it also suggests a relative degree of impermeability that other actors don't have the same access and play a role in terms of changing or altering the shape of the nature of transactions that are taking place among these actors. But so again, we have the iron triangle as an example of that process. Now, besides the various actors that we have to play, and again, we can actually talk about many other kinds of actors as well, but we'll just move on here. Other actors that play a key role, or I'm sorry, not other actors, but we'll shift and talk about different kinds of tools that we have as a country to influence the behavior of other nations. So again, what kinds of diplomatic tools that are out there to help influence other countries? Now these tools are more or less, they can be effective, but in some cases they've shown to be very effective, in other cases not very effective at all. Well, one that we've mentioned before is this idea of formal recognition. When the president decides to grant formal recognition to a country and to receive its ambassadors, I mean, again, that's a very, very powerful kind of tool. It confers a sense of legitimacy upon the new country, and in the eyes of other countries around the world, they're saying the United States has granted, or the President of the United States has granted recognition to this new country and their right to exist. And so again, that can be a very, very powerful message, very, very powerful in terms of symbolic value, and other countries may in turn take similar steps to recognize these new countries or a new country when it's formed. And we think about, for example, in 1948 when our president formally recognized Israel as a nation. We think about the emerging republics of the Commonwealth of Independent States following the fall of the Soviet Union. George Bush's granting recognition to former Baltic nations of the Soviet Union as like Estonia and Latvia. So again, formal recognition can be a very, very powerful tool, but again, it's more of a symbolic kind of tool than in terms of what happens there. Now, the opposite of that in a lot of ways can be a more powerful tool, and again, but much of this is also symbolic in nature. And that is the opposite is not so much that we would no longer recognize a country's right to exist, but what we do is we break off diplomatic relations. We can formally break off diplomatic relations, and again, to signal our displeasure of what's going on in the country. So, for example, in 1979, when Iran took U.S. hostages from the U.S. embassy, and they made U.S. Foreign Service personnel hostages, we formally broke off diplomatic relations with these countries, and other countries, allies, followed suit. And again, that can carry some symbolic value, but how effective is it necessarily? You know, again, it has more of a symbolism effect than anything else. But what's the way we can signal our displeasure? For many years, we saw also on a lesser scale, we didn't formally break off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union by any means, but a lot of times what would happen is when, during the period of the Cold War, the Soviet Union might accuse some American personnel over in their country as spying, presenting some evidence that we were spying on the Soviet Union. And they might capture these individuals, put them in jail, or throw them out of the country, and declare them as persona non grata, which basically means we're expelling you from the country. We're no longer recognizing your diplomats here, these particular diplomats. And then, of course, the United States would follow suit. You know, whenever they kick out our diplomats, we kick out some of their diplomats. You know, and by the same token, whenever we caught someone from the Soviet Union spying on the U.S., you know, we would kick them out, and then the Soviet Union would follow suit. So you saw a lot of that tit for tat going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, particularly during the time period of the Cold War. But besides the idea of granting formal recognition, besides throwing out diplomats or breaking off diplomatic relationships with other countries, foreign aid can be a very important form of influence. And we can see it, and again, either granting foreign aid or cutting off foreign aid can be a form of this. Also, along the same ideas, economic sanctions can play a role as well. But for example, we provide a lot of foreign aid to Israel. We continue to do so. Back during the time when Ronald Reagan was president, he provided a lot of foreign aid to El Salvador, again, to help stave off part of our policy of containment, to help reduce the communist influence. Many third world nations, developing nations, we would provide foreign aid, because the idea behind that, and this would be in the form of economic assistance, trade assistance, humanitarian aid as well. And the idea behind this was that if we could help stabilize these fledgling regimes, you know, they might be less vulnerable to collapse by the Soviet Union, the Soviet or communist takeover. Again, thinking about our policy of containment, the domino theory. So by providing foreign aid, that might be an effective way to help prop up these regimes to help stop the spread of communism around the world. So that can be potentially an effective form of foreign aid. More specifically, humanitarian aid for, to help starvation and providing that to countries that are undergoing drought periods, such as Ethiopia and other sub-Saharan countries, can be potentially an effective form of way to help, and not only help those individuals who are starving and provide water and technical assistance in digging wells and things like that, but it can also, in the process of doing though, again, create a whole lot of, has a lot of symbolic value of looking at the United States as being a nation that really does care about the world. And one of the things I'll have to give George W. Bush a lot of credit for is during his administration, he took major steps and put a lot of money into funding for combating AIDS in Africa, because AIDS is a very serious problem over in Africa, and he is taking a lot of steps in terms of providing money and assistance and resources and vaccines and medicines to help combat AIDS in Africa. And more than any other president, I mean, he has done a lot in that regard. But again, that can be a very effective tool of foreign policy. Again, we can also decide by contrast to withhold aid for countries that are not acting in a way that we think is appropriate. So if they're acting in our interests, we may provide more foreign aid. If they start acting against our interests, we might actually withhold foreign aid. We certainly may try to provide, for example, economic sanctions. For example, if Iran is engaging in the production of nuclear weapons, we may try to get other countries to stop trade in a lot of areas with Iran as a way to signal our displeasure. We did the same thing in the 1990s with Saddam Hussein, when Saddam Hussein was trying to basically engage in a period of his own military buildup. The United States tried to engage and did engage in economic sanctions against Iraq, and worked with other countries to engage in economic sanctions with Iraq as well. So again, ways to signal their displeasure. Same thing with North Korea. If North Korea is doing things that we don't like in terms of nuclear buildup and acquiring nuclear technology, then we'll try to work with other countries to impose economic sanctions, because we have found that economic sanctions can be an important form and an effective tool to potentially influence their behavior, but it doesn't always do that, and sometimes it actually can work against our interests as well. But again, the idea of foreign aid can be an effective tool. And interestingly, you always hear a lot of debate about how much foreign aid should we provide other countries, because a lot of people, when you ask in public opinion surveys here in the United States, again, depending upon how you word the question, you're going to get different results. But sometimes if you have a question like, do you think we're providing way too much in the way of foreign aid to other countries, and should that aid be used more here at home to help the conditions of poverty and starvation here? A lot of people will resoundingly say yes, we should be less foreign aid, and more that should come here to and help our own people. But again, I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that if you don't have some of this aid that's flowing, then potentially you may have some problems that are much, much worse. And I think, for example, recently with Pakistan trying to minimize and reduce the degree of Taliban influence in Pakistan. You know, Pakistan's got nuclear weapons. Pakistan is a country that, you know, if it fell to Taliban influence and control, automatically, you know, giving them access to nuclear weapons, you know, potentially would be horrific for the world. And so there you'd say foreign aid to help ensure the preservation, the protection of nuclear weapons might be in the United States' interest to help quell the influence of the Taliban to promote democracy over there would be a very important thing, and stabilize their political situation would be in the United States' best interest to do so. So besides foreign aid, we have other tools available, obviously treaties, conducting treaties, and certainly executive agreements, as we've talked about before, scientific and technical exchange agreements, formal treaties, treaties that are going on right now in terms of limiting the spread of nuclear weapons, for example. You know, even historically, we've had a number of agreements with the former Soviet Union, something called the START talks and the SALT talks, SALT 1 and SALT 2, Strategic Arms Limitation talks, and current talks that are going on with the idea of reducing the nuclear arsenal that the United States and Russia currently possess. So again, these can be very significant kinds of treaties, the nuclear non-proliferation treaties that are signed on by many countries around the world, and to be a signatory to sign on to these kinds of treaties. Global treaties such as the Kyoto Protocol for environmental to contain global warming and to protect the environment would be some of the other examples of how treaties can play an influential role, and then the United States playing a role as being a signatory to these treaties can help, you know, can have a lot of value in both real terms and also in terms of symbolic value as well around the world. Besides that, besides treaties with other countries, we also have covert actions. Now these are actions you can call overt versus covert. Covert actions that we may see and that we have seen in our country, in our history, often undertaken by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Covert actions are actions that are secret actions. For example, training freedom fighters, providing weapons to overthrow regimes, to engage in assassinations of other leaders, or to fund money to groups. The CIA may fund money to other groups to overthrow a regime or to assassinate leaders. This kind of attempt to change the regime in other countries that are unfriendly to the United States, these kinds of secretive actions are all called covert actions. And again, we often tie these kinds of actions going on with the CIA, but it could be some other agencies involved as well, such as the National Security Agency. Now, other ways in which we influence the behavior of other countries, let's go back to a slight variation of the economic sanctions, and that is trade status. There is something called Most Favored Nation trade status, and there are other kinds of trade programs too. And what we try to do is that we may actually grant a country what would be called Most Favored Nation status and tie the granting of that status to their improvement in such areas like protecting human rights, all right? And so the idea here is that if you are taking measurable steps to protect human rights, if you're stopping, for example, you know, sweatshops and child labor in these countries, if you take these actions, we may grant you as a country Most Favored Nation status. And what's important about that is that Most Favored Nation status means that you're going to be treated in the same group as other of our best trading partners in terms of not having to pay anywhere as much in the way of like tariffs or quotas on the importation of your goods into the United States. So MFN, or Most Favored Nation status, will give you a break, and that can have significant economic benefits, particularly those industries that are involved in exporting their goods over to the United States. All right, so we say that in order for you to gain that special privileged status, you have to, you know, we're tying it to specific kinds of conditions here, like you're promoting democracy, you're not suppressing dissidents, you are engaging in protection of human rights, and you're not engaging in trade practices that hurt your people, such as, again, engaging in child labor or sweatshops, things like that. So those are some of the various types of tools, the diplomatic tools that we have to alter or influence the behavior of other nations. And again, to some degree, they are effective. In other cases, they're not. And there's no set formula that says under what conditions these are going to be more effective than others. But in a lot of ways, sometimes they have ended up actually working against our interest. But the bottom line here is that these are the types of tools that we try to operate and develop. And again, I underscore the fact that these are called diplomatic tools because they do try to are approached largely under the realm of diplomacy with other nations, other than covert actions here. So it's working with other nations to try to influence their behavior in the right direction. Now, again, I guess what I should say in terms of the last bit of material here is that when we look at all of our foreign policy, all the different institutions that are involved in the making of foreign policy, if we look at the different actors that are involved, if we look at the history of foreign policy, if we look at how that has changed, how our foreign policy and our obligations and commitments have changed over time, and if we look at specifically where we are today, back basically in the midst of what I see as a lot of potential turbulence and chaos overseas, and a lot of potential danger spots, a lot of hot spots, in a lot of ways that really has some very significant implications for our security today. Again, and we think about how 9/11 has changed our thinking in homeland security and all this. A lot of that then goes back to the whole issue about how much effort and attention should we devote toward foreign and defense policy. And it goes back to that guns versus butter debate. How much resources should we scale back our military? Should we improve our military? To what extent should we change the nature of our weapons systems? To what extent do we have current funding of weapons systems that are antiquated and we need to move toward a more modern type of new kind of weapon system and fund more of the more technologically advanced weapon systems and get rid of the older ones? So again, a lot of these are the kinds of issues that occupy our thinking and should be done as well. So I guess the bottom line here is that foreign policy and defense policy is in itself, the making of foreign and defense policy is a very, very different animal. And when we talk about policy making in general, we've got the different kinds of models and different kinds of processes that are involved. And those kinds of models and processes certainly do apply to the making of foreign policy. But as you can see, in a lot of ways, it's a very, very complex and convoluted issue that's changing every day, particularly in light of how the world is changing every day, as well as how our international obligations and commitment and this whole trend toward globalization, how it also has an impact in terms of our connection, our involvement. And all these things together, therefore, underscore the importance of foreign and defense policy. This is probably a good time to conclude our discussion of foreign and defense policy. In our next session, we're going to move on and talk about a very, very different topic, and that is the final section of the material in this course, and that is the judicial system. We'll be talking about the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court operates, but basically all about our court system. And then we're also going to move in and conclude our course by discussing the various civil rights and civil liberties and the struggle for equality over the history of our country. So for now, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.